أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي، صلاة تنحل بها العقد وتنفرج بها الكرب، وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم بأنواع كمالاتك في جميع تجلياتك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد، أول الأنوار الفائضة من بحور عظمة الذات المتحقق في عالمي البطون والظهور بمعاني الأسماء والصفات، فهو أول حامد ومتعبد بأنواع العبادات والقربات، والممد في عالم الأرواح والأشباح لجميع الموجودات، وعلى آله وأصحابه صلاة تكشف لنا النقاب عن وجهه الكريم في المراء واليقظات، وتعرفنا بك وبه في جميع المراتب والحضرات. والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات. والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات. والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون، وسلام على المرسلين، والحمد لله رب العالمين. So, as I said, just right in the middle of 78, let us look now very briefly at a concluding example, which presents an example representative of another of the most serious difficulties posed to the notion of a thing itself in itself, irrespective of the perspective of a subject, even when the thing itself in question is an extramental particular. Right? Blind people, of course, exist outside of our minds, obviously, and yet blindness as a concept is mind dependent, in that it constitutes a privation because it's simply an absence of sightedness, formed by affixing a negation to the intelligible form of sight that is obtained in the mind. Right? So as a privation, يشتمل على negation. So 159, that's just a reference. It's not you'll find that principle everywhere. There's just one reference for it. Yet irrespective of whether or not there are other knowing subjects to perceive it, people that are blind really do lack sight. Right? And just as what they call nowadays a thought experiment, in 160 said, should we imagine, for example, that the sole existing person be a blind one? People that are blind really do lack sight. So they really do lack sight, regardless of whether you're looking at them or not. And the epistemological factor of the matter in which we process blindness, right, that epistemological procedure by which we process the intelligible concept blindness in terms of a negation, the negation of sightedness, it's the absence of sightedness, is quite irrelevant to this fact in the external world. Right? That the person who approaches us in the street is blind rather than sighted is, after all, not a fact that has been caused by our minds, because although epistemologically this requires a negation, which is a purely mental event, obviously privations can't exist with Kharij, that's the whole point of them, and negations are purely mental activities, and yet blindness just is the negation of sight. So how does that work? So the person who approaches in the street is blind rather than sighted is, after all, not a fact that has been caused by our minds. This is really the crux of the matter when we discuss a potential confusion of epistemology for ontology, which is happening all the time in immanentism. Were blindness ontologically mind-dependent, our minds would constitute the cause of the phenomenon of the absence of sight. They're obviously not. Yet in the real world, it is merely epistemologically mind-dependent. That is, we only intellect the phenomenon of blindness through acknowledging the absence of a concept, sightedness, which, unlike blindness, presents an independently intelligible form to us. Right? So the phenomenon of sight is distinct in itself. Blindness is not. It's composed of something which is distinct in itself and a negation, and its point is to negate that positive concept. So sightedness, unlike blindness, presents an independently intelligible form to us such that its intellection requires no negation, nor the affiction of a foreign concept in order to obtain in the mind. On the other hand, privation certainly cannot exist in the sense of physical individuation in the external world. That's their whole point. That's why they're called privations. And so it is quite out of the question that a blind man should be blind fil kharij. But blind people are blind fil kharij. And yet it is equally clear that blindness, though epistemologically mind-dependent, is not ontologically so, because we encounter people who are blind. Up until the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Ismail Gelenbevi was widely acknowledged as one of the most important philosophers and theologians of the latter centuries of Islam. Mustafa Sabri described him as the greatest of the Turkish critical verifiers of the latter centuries, and Abu Thanat al-Alusi called him the greatest of the later scholar sages. So in the note, this is how Sabri describes him in Mawqif al-Aql, and there's a reference in Ruh al-Ma'ani, in both his commentary on Surat Hud and his commentary on al-Anbiya. Al-Alusi calls him the greatest of the later scholars. Gelenbevi was also the founder of the latest major school of logic in the Arabic tradition, as testified to by the works of Ibn al-Qaradaghi, on his commentary on the Burhan of Gelenbevi, Sikhal, Rahib, etc., as well as those of his student, Sheikh Abdul Karim al-Madarris, my sheikhs, one of my sheikhs, and a host of other late logicians and theologians who employ a mode of classification and treat topics that first appeared in the Burhan. Gelenbevi's influence post-1800 in theological realm was also huge. His Harsha on Dawani commentary on al-Ghudiyya, for example, was a major advanced kalam text study in the later Ottoman curriculum. In his Tahqiq Ilm Allahi bil-Ma'dumat, he cites this problem to point to the insufficiency of the simple division of Nafs al-Amr into al-Kharij and al-Dhihn. We might call this the objective blind man. But the fact that the subsistence of blindness in extramental particulars possesses actuality in things as they are in themselves, and the further fact that this subsistence neither constitutes mental existence nor extramental particular subsistence, annuls the mutakallimun's confinement of intrinsic existence, literally things as they are in themselves existence, al-wujūd al-nafs al-amri, to actualized extramental particular and mental existence. Now, of course, one could say, rather than in brackets, I could have put the philosopher, but Gelenbevi elsewhere says that the majority of the kalam muhaqqiqin believe in wujūd dhihni. And it's very well known that in the later period, many of the great muhaqqiqun adopted wujūd dhihni as the stronger position based on this and other proofs, which you find on the previous page at the top, etc. So one can quibble about whether that should have been the mutakallimun or the philosopher, but it really makes no difference whatsoever. So their confinement of intrinsic existence to actualized extramental particular mental existence. What's that note? I've got that. Yeah, actualized, that is not merely potential, right? And for 163, that subsistence is important because it's thubut. It's not wujud khariji. No one's saying it's wujud khariji. That's the whole point. If it was wujud khariji, it would have to be a ta'ayyunable sifa, and you can't individuate a privation. So by definition, it can't exist fil kharij. It's not an individuated thing. It's a negation. It's a mental property, right? But blindness, which it contains this negation pertaining to the positive concept of sightedness, obviously it's something fil kharij because there are blind people. So we'll say it's subsistence. Now, the fact it possesses actuality in nafs al-amr, but it's not mental existence because it's the thubut of it fil kharij, right? It's the blind person who's blind. It's not mental existence, nor extramental particular subsistence, because it's not wujud khariji, and we don't believe in subsistence, right? If we're on this position, which is there's existence and there's there's non-existence. لا واسطة بين الوجود والعدم. There's either mental existence or there's extra-mental particular existence. Okay. So it's not mental existence and it's not extra-mental particular subsistence, although it would have to be, given the claim, given the exigency, rather, of the problem, but we don't accept extra-mental particular subsistence, annuls their confinement of intrinsic existence, literally things as they are in themselves existence, al-wujūd al-nafs al-amri, to actualized, not potential, extra-mental particular and mental existence. So لما كان الثبوت الخارجي للعامة متحققا في نفس الأمر ولم يكن ثبوتا ذهنيا ولا وجودا خارجيا فقد انتقض به حصرهم الوجود النفس الأمري في الوجود الخارجي والذهني المحققين. Right? So what is the point here? The point is there is an inconsistency in your mental existence, extra-mental particular existence ontology. Why? Because the linguistic meaning of extra-mental in English and Arabic means what's outside the mind, right? And they're saying all that is, so that's the broad universal, but they're saying what actually does exist outside the mind are extra-mental particulars. That's what it means to be mawjūd, right? So am I saying there's something other than existence in the mind and existence outside the mind? Obviously, that's an exhaustive binary. Things are either in the mind or outside the mind. Now, I'm saying we need to broaden our conception of what extra-mental means. That's what I'm saying. Am I saying Gelenbevi is deciding upon an alternative? La. I'm saying he's pointing out an inconsistency. That's what he's doing. A lot of mutakallimun are very happy to point out an inconsistency. They're less inclined to provide an alternative ontology which solves the inconsistency. Without wanting to get sidetracked by that, there is a sense in which that makes sense. I mean, there are different types of kalam. There's no doubt about it. There are some who think that this is about al-bahth an haqa'iq al-ashya'. And it's much closer to a definition of philosophy, whether it's mawjūd bima huwa mawjūd ala qanun al-Islam, or also is embraced in some sense by a broader definition of philosophy rather than that one, which is metaphysics turned into kalam, which is, haqa'iq al-ashya' ala ma hiya alayha في نفس الأمر بقدر الطاقة البشرية, for example. But if the purpose of kalam, as it is for many, is more a way of making space for the aqa'id by removing what seem to be philosophical obstacles, making it easier to believe in some in a particular formulation of the aqaid and one sees that as a process of removing philosophical obstacles to belief in that aqaid, which I don't think works, by the way, because I don't think that you can understand in a rigorously philosophical sense what the aqaid is stating unless you have a profound and comprehensive philosophical framework. Right. And we're talking about in a polemical context. The Sahaba had profound experiential knowledge of that shuhudi metaphysical framework. So it's not so much just that they didn't need what we're talking about. They had something infinitely superior. But in the polemical context, speaking to one's philosophical interlocutor, some of whom have a very comprehensive theory of existence, you can't defend your aqaid against them unless you have a better comprehensive framework, metaphysical framework in which you situate your metaphysical theories. So in any case, there's a problem here. We know that blind people exist and they don't fit in al-wujūd al-khariji on your definition. and they don't fit in wujūd dhihni on your definition, then what Gelenbevi does bring up is al-wujūd al-mawhūm, which, I'm sorry, the reason I didn't mention it in the book is because I don't think it is at all helpful. You're welcome to go back and look at the no disrespect, of course. I genuinely love and hugely respect Gelenbevi, and anyone who reads him can't fail to do so. But I mean, how does that solve the problem? It's a property that seems to be ascribed to the dhihn. And somehow, I mean, is that supposed to allow us to stay within mental and extramental particular? And it would certainly be subject to all of the same criticisms of immanentism. If nature is imbued with rational principles, and nature is intelligible in itself, and nature, I mean, originally means essence. We don't want to have the all of the connotations of a modern scientific understanding of nature. But if the extramental distinct world of essence is imbued intrinsically with rational principles, and if if we have a more expansive view of extramental existence, even in terms of the immanent world, right, the world of experience, which isn't limited to just the individuation of properties through the categories, right, then sure, we can have a broader conception of the mental, and by that we don't mean the immanent mental, my mind, your mind, Sidi Niaz's mind, but rather intellect itself with a capital I, as it were. And we could use any number of different frameworks, in that the sensible world is derivative of the world of intellect. It constitutes a determination of the world of intellect. And there are meanings which possess a form of reality independent of our epistemological mode of identifying them. So there is a problem here in this example, and there are many other examples one could bring, light and darkness, and which is that the ontology has to be reductive about those negative properties, because they're negative in terms of the mode of epistemological, the mode by which they're processed epistemologically. But it's based on an assumption that extramental existence means properties which are individuated by the categories, right? So one simply has to have a broader, sure, one can say that the sensible world exists by participating in the intelligible world, and it's a more limited determination of an intelligible world. But the problem here is to say that all we acknowledge are immanent minds and extramental particulars. There's no way to extend immanent minds to a subsistence taking place within extramental particulars, because the whole point is that property is not supposed to be there, because according to our epistemological description, the only reason it's there is because of our mental activity. But we know that that's not the case. But the point is, a privation can't present itself extramentally, but it is. So there's something wrong with the ontology. If as a privation, blindness cannot become instantiated in particulars, where is the objective blind man we meet in the street blind? Where is he blind? not in my mind that he's blind. The questions that we've treated up to this point in this section have shown that, as traditionally defined, the realm of extramental particulars cannot provide an adequate ontological account or serve as the guarantor of the existence or truth of numerous entities and propositions, which would, however, seem at first sight to belong firmly to the category of extramental particular entities. This includes extramental particulars like beds and houses, the differentia of which are contingent on the prior activity of mind, subsequent to which these intelligible entities become fixed in extramental particulars. People might say, oh, well, they're human creations. Well, that doesn't explain very much. They're extramental particular entities which exist outside of our minds, but they depend upon mental entities in order to be intelligible, right? And in order to, that's almost tautological. What I meant is they depend on intelligible entities for their form, for their extramental form, right? So that's not really a problem at all, but it's a bit of a problem when we're talking about the immanentism of extramental particulars, mental entities. So 2, extramental entities, the intellection of which involves the negation of a concept, like the blindness of an extramental particular blind man and the darkness of an extramental particular room. And 3, the genus and differentia of any given extramental essence. Although the form of the essence represented by the genus and differentia truly exists, it does not do so in the same mode of differentiation internally. An extramental particular man is, with respect to his intelligible form, a real and simple unity. The multiplicitous and universal forms of animal and rational that constitute his definitional essence are grounded, apparently, in the extramental particular and arise from the extramental particular, yet extramental particulars is not where the genus and differentia exist qua universals, right? So the much broader theme of the book is we have the problem of intelligible entities that aren't instantiated at all, that aren't extramental entities, right? One might say that, which is tahakkuman. I mean, it's really rather begging the question, masadaratan, that they are abstracted from sensible particulars, but sensible particulars show no sign of them. When I look at sensible particulars, I see extension and lots of sensible properties. So why are you telling me that I'm getting unity and possibility and necessity and conjunction and relation and all of these intelligible properties from it? You're just saying that. So that's the main thing. But what I'm saying is, even when it comes to extramental particulars, there are even extramental particulars where the extramental particular mental ontology doesn't work. Nafs al-amr, on the other hand, constitutes this complete guarantor. So what we're saying is Nafs al-amr is a form of, Nafs al-amr is extramental reality in the broadest sense, and extramental particulars are just one type of Nafs al-amri entity. So Nafs al-amr is really extramental reality as it should have been, as it really is. Nafs al-amr, on the other hand, constitutes this complete guarantor. It informs even extramental particulars and renders them intelligible. Rational animal is the multiplicitous form in the mind grounded in Nafs al-amr that is instantiated by the individual human and represents the proper mode of the intellection of an individual human being in its relational context. But in the individual distinctness of its isolated extramental form, each human being is a unitive essence. The purpose of this necessarily detailed exposition of the perspectival aspects of quiddities and intellection has been to uncover the fact that human perspectives are objective, nafs al-amri, elements of the world. Indeed, they are indispensable mental elements without which the world could not be intelligible to human beings. Accurate human representation of the world as a part of the world quite as objective as the rest of the world, as is the human contribution to the world's objectivity, intelligibility. Nafs al-amr, objective reality, is partially thus a human reality, though not a subjective human reality. The reason for this will become clear when we explore an altogether deeper region of philosophy in chapter 4. Suffice to say, it pertains to two momentous principles that underlie all that is most distinctive about Akbarian and certain late kalam conceptions of truth and objective reality. The first is that intelligible reality is ontologically prior to physical and sensible reality. The second is that the being of the entire cosmos is radically contingent on cognition and in a different way on human beings. Yet this is strictly not a form of idealism as that word is usually understood. Rather, it is recognition that the very being of the world constitutes a branch of the Muhammadan reality, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the perfect form of humankind from whose light it has been created and who is simultaneously its final cause. 166. See, for example, Bursi Ruh al-Bayan. See, for example, Bursi Ruh al-Bayan, which says, قَدْ اتَّفَقَ أَهْلُ الظَّاهِرِ وَالشُّهُودِ على أن الله تعالى خلق جميع الأشياء من نور محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. So today it's a big controversy. It wasn't before. So that should really give people pause for thought. قد اتفق أهل الظاهر والشهود على أن الله تعالى خلق جميع الأشياء من نور محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. Right. Is that invoking kashf in the middle of a philosophical argument, as unfortunately lots of people seem to think? Well, there's so many assumptions there in that statement. One is that kashf is radically different from reason. What's reason? Most of the people won't be able to tell me. Is there a distinction between discursive reason and the receptivity of reason? Is there a distinction between dianoia and noesis? And who says that there aren't philosophical arguments for wahdat al-wujūd in the sound sense, for the muthal, for the haqiqa Muhammadiyya, indeed? And if there are, which there are, how is that possible? Well, the reason you think it's not, because of your strict dichotomy between kashf and reason. It's true that kashf exceeds reason because it's direct acquaintance. It's meeting the haqa'iq rather than seeing them through a glass darkly, that is deductively, or inferring them. That's not the same as seeing them, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a common thread of intelligibility, because the aql is just one of the powers of the spirit, and that those haqa'iq which are experiential leave their traces in an intelligible structure, which is something that I discuss on page. If you'd like to have a look at that, there's a bit on that on page 23 and 4 and 20 and 21. Well, no, really 18 to 21 and then 23 and 4. Though in my second edition, inshallah ta'ala, there's going to be a lot more on that, because you sense in the reception of a book which are the things that people really have found difficulty with, and I think that's definitely what that needs to be expanded a lot. Rather, it is a recognition that the very being of the world constitutes a branch of the Muhammadan reality, the perfect form of humankind, from whose light it has been created and who is simultaneously its final cause. And as we will see, it is moreover a recognition that the meaning of the created being, of the ultimate created essence, and the most perfect locus of manifestation of the names of God, and likewise the meaning of creation as pertaining to all other essences, the exemplary realities of which arise from that Muhammadan reality, can be no other than their own self-consciousness. We'll see this in chapter 4. Thus, although some of the statements we'll encounter in chapter 4 will seem identical in expression to the idealist esse est percipi, to exist is to be perceived, we will see that they arise from a very different context. 168. George Berkeley, the father of idealism in modern Western philosophy, formulated his esse est percipi as a refutation of John Locke's notion of purportedly mind-independent existent substances, nonetheless rendered impossible of direct access by Locke's own post-scholastic theory of ideas, which held that these ideas are the sole entities truly epistemologically accessible to us. On this account, the traditional notion of abstraction is retained, but without a tenable justification. Actually, I don't think any of it has a justification, but this has even less. Because of Locke's rejection of the possibility of knowledge of real essences, ensuring that we have no way of knowing whether or not our ideas of substances truly arise from real experimental substances. On one prominent reading of Berkeley, or Berkeley, I'm not sure how I pronounce him anymore, after having lived in Berkeley, he simply, which is actually named after him, he simply eliminated the inconsistency and tension in Locke's overall theory by doing away with the notion of mind-independent substances altogether. Berkeley, moreover, grounded his idealism in a rejection of Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. That's a mistake. I'm terribly sorry. See, that's one of these things. How it got there? I don't know. I was probably reading Aristotle. And I put primary and secondary substances, but it's primary and secondary qualities, which is very important for philosophy of science. The notion of an unperceived version of our idea of quantity, to take one example of a primary quality that, unlike secondary qualities, supposedly resembles a power in the actual object, is just as meaningless. This was the basis of Berkeley's critique, and it's actually very powerful. It's just as meaningless as that of an unperceived taste, a secondary quality, because in Berkeley's famous dictum, an idea can be like nothing but an idea. See a very good article actually by Ayers, who's a big expert, Berkeley's immaterialism and Kant's transcendent idealism. This is where he contrasts them. Kant, of course, added a whole section to his second edition of the CPR called Refutation of Idealism, because people were saying, oh, you're just a Berkeleyan. And he was trying to say, no, I'm a realist. And it's very factual, I can tell you, that section. He's fighting a losing battle. In any case, so moreover, even if apparently inanimate objects exist through the Mohammedan reality, through their own modes of self-consciousness, they can still exist independently alongside human beings, irrespective of whether they are being actively perceived by individual human beings. So this is really, if the sensible is a fara of the intelligible, right, then this all makes sense. But if we have this completely dichotomous conception of mentality versus, physicality, which is supposed to have nothing to do with mentality, the legacy, if you like, of the Cartesian split, although there's more to it than that, then you only have these stark and completely irreconcilable choices, right? And these statements would be interpreted just as idealism. But if reality is imbued with rational principles and the physical is a branch of the intelligible rather than the other way around, I always like what Findlay says, that for Aristotle, the intelligible is parasitic on the individual. If you have it the other way around, then there's not much room there, because and again, a recurrent theme is, how do you root intelligible principles ontologically? And when there's an awful lot of unwitting taqlid of Aristotle going on, that's actually very, very difficult. Actually, it's impossible. And so you end up with these aporia, they're aporia, so they're unresolvable. So for now, we will return to somewhat more sober matters and outline the development of Nafs al-Amr theory within the broadly peripatetic tradition of Islamic theology and philosophy up to the time of Tashkib-Rizadeh, who we contend is one of the key crossover figures. To show the manner in which he combined our different Akbarian and Avicennan streams of thought, we will need to provide a somewhat detailed exposition of the Akbarian tradition position in chapter 4. At the end of the chapter, we will meet with Tashkib-Rizadeh's marrying of the two positions. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad. Yes, Sidi, you had a question, Habibi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Since universal particulars were mentioned, I wanted to take the chance to ask some relevant questions. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala individuates possibilities from the immutable archetypes, does he not know beforehand which possibilities will be actualized? If so, is that more a general ilm that the prior knowledge pertains to? I mean to ask if it subsists in a more general ilm, and if there is a difference between the ayan and general ilm to begin with. Right, I see what you're saying. Well, first of all, if you look at on page 55, things, that is, possibles, are in their state of non-existence, distinct in their entities. God, transcendently glorified be He, knows them as they are in themselves, ala ma hiya alayhi fi nafsiha, and He sees them and commands them to be existentiated, that is to exist, and they come into existence at his command. The knowledge that is with God is not general, just as the particularized essences of possible beings are not general. Rather, in itself and in God's knowledge, all is detailed. كله في نفسه وفي علم الله مفصل. It is only with us that this generalized knowledge obtains, right? So there's no general knowledge. Allah Ta'ala in his infinite plenitude, right? In his simplicity, in the sense of non-compositeness. Simplicity is a power. The more determined and multiplicitous the determinations get, the less power they have, because the more ihtiyaj they have to the different parts, to the tarkib, to the conditions of the degree of existence at which they obtain, because if they're Walaikum salam, Habibi, if they're further down in, I have to go in 1 minute, if they're further down in the unfolding of maratib, they're in more of a state of ihtiyaj, right? So simplicity in the sense of non-compositeness is power. It is plenitude. It is. So Allah Ta'ala knows his own infinite essence, and he knows in his own infinite essence all of the infinite possible ways of looking at himself, right? Of knowledge of himself through madahir, through loci of manifestation by which he contemplates himself, right? And these are the ayana thabita, right? Of course, Allah Ta'ala does know beforehand which possibilities will be actualized. But in the Akbarian tradition, Allah Ta'ala's free will means his tafdeel of ma sabaqa bihi ilmuhu, right? We don't have an anthropomorphic conception of God where there's all the possibilia and then God surveys the possibilities and then he chooses, because that implies taraddud, as if he didn't know beforehand, then he had to survey them. But rather it's tafdeel ma sabaqa bihi ilmuhu. His knowledge is an eternal sifa, which is the consequence of his self-knowledge, right? The ayana thabita become determinate through, it's true, it is through al-fayd al-aqdas al-dhati, right? And this is it's an i'tibari understanding of the relationship between God's essence and the ayana thabita, right? The ayana thabita qua determinate are not God. The meaning of al-siwa in Akbarianism is the determinate. So all these clever clogs going around saying that it's wahdat al-mawjūd, that's not wahdat al-mawjūd, that's wahdat al-wujūd, right? It's not wahdat al-mawjūd, it's wahdat al-wujūd, right? And you get into, there are many formulations in Akbarian work saying that the khilaf is lafzi, because we all agree that determinate entities are posterior to Allah Ta'ala's existence, that Allah is prior to them and is distinct from them. But you call that wujud khariji, and we just don't call it existence at all. So it's a khilaf lafzi. That's what Muhammad ibn Umar al-Qadiri says in his beautiful commentary on as-salat al-faydiyya. But in any case, Allah Ta'ala, or the ayana thabita does not just contain the existence which will subsequently unfold into alam al-arwah. It contains all of the possibilia, right? It contains all of the possibilia. By his irada, which is tafdeel ma sabaqa bihi ilmuhu, some of those, the the ayana thabita that he determines will unfold into the alam al-arwah and into alam al-mithal and into alam al-mulk will unfold, but there are possibilia which don't unfold, right? There are possibilia which don't unfold, but they're still determinate in his knowledge, right? So there's no general ilm, and there's no prior knowledge, except in the sense that the ayana thabita are the level of al-wahidiyya, right? Al-wahda is al-haqiqa al-muhammadiyya, which is itself an ayn thabit, because all of the other ayana thabita are branches of al-haqiqa al-muhammadiyya, al-wahda. It's seen as a barzakh, which is in a way its own. It's an i'tibari, it's a martaba aqliya, right? And we need to go into this at another time, understanding what this means, when we're talking about al-ahadiyya and al-wahda and al-wahidiyya. Saying it's a martaba aqliya doesn't mean to relativize or subjectivize it, but it's important to understand these. Inshallah, we'll go into these later. There's plenty of opportunities in chapter 4. But the point is, the ayana thabita to the level of al-wahidiyya, because the asma, the dhuhur of the asma happens through the ayana thabita. It doesn't mean God doesn't have the asma in himself, but the dhuhur, you see, this is why it's a martaba aqli. The dhuhur happens. The dhuhur is a relational concept. It means there's someone that's becoming zahir too, which is creation, which is us. Right, so the dhuhur of the asma comes through the ayana thabita, because that's the highest possible, that's the absolute summit of possible human knowledge. The furthest we can go in human knowledge is the level of the ayana thabita. Right, and that's agreed upon by everybody, even Ahmad Sirhindi, who's really an Akbarian, and he's a wonderful, wonderful saint to know. Qaddasallahu ruhu. He acknowledges that he learned the science of the maratib al-wujūd from al-Shaykh al-Akbar, and he acknowledges that Shaykh al-Akbar is from the awliya, but of course he has his criticisms as well, which most of those who succeeded him in the Sirhindian line actually sided with Ibn Arabi on, interestingly enough, which is a very interesting phenomenon. But radiallahu anhu. But in any case, even Imam Sirhindi agrees about that. Which the highest possible level of knowledge attainable is the ayana thabita. And so that's why the dhuhur of the asma takes place through the ayana thabita. But that is the level of the wahidiyya. So yes, God in himself, in his ahadiyya, possesses knowledge, right? He possesses all of his sifat, but this is a level, this is a degree of, it's martabat la ta'ayyun, it's completely ineffable. We can't have any knowledge of it. We have knowledge of it, but there's no possible shuhudi knowledge of it. So, and it's fundamentally a negative knowledge. So, yes, he has, in that sense, there is a prior knowledge, which is identical to the divine essence. But it's not a general knowledge. There's no general knowledge with Allah Ta'ala. So, and there's no need for there to be a gap between knowing which ones are going to be actualized, because all of his knowledge is a consequence of his self-knowledge. It doesn't rest upon will. What rests upon will are what rests upon will is the unfolding into the different levels, right? Now, conceptually, that doesn't need a prior knowledge to say, well, walillahi al-mathal a'la, this particular Ein Thabit is one of the ones which is going to unfold into other levels of existence. It's just the fact that they do unfold into other levels of existence. That's enough conceptually for us to understand that they are going to. So one would say maybe that Ein Thabit has a broader, a more expansive reality. Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry to be a bit blustering and hasty today, but I've got to go. So keep me in your prayers, and thank you again very, very much. Thank you. Take care, baby. Assalamu alaikum.